My name's Richard Hodgkins. I'm a Senior Lecturer in Physical Geography at Loughborough University, and I'm here to help answer some of the questions you put through Loughborough University's Instagram on climate change. First one I have here is, has global warming gone beyond saving? Can we survive it? Or is it over? How long till we die from climate change, and how am I going to make it past the age of 50? Well, I made it past the age of 50, so if I can, anyone can. I think there is a really important question here. We're not going to be able to stop warming from happening, but we can always stop things getting worse. There's never going to come a point where we can't stop things getting worse. The future, to a very large extent, is in our own hands. Nothing is inevitable, and so it's really important to keep that in mind. Nothing is inevitable. We're not heading for a certain apocalypse. It's in our hands what we can do. And it's really important to bear that in mind, because if we take action to decarbonise, then we can actually have some real impacts. So to take the example of the UK, if you had a 2 degrees centigrade warming in the UK, that would, due to sea level rise, that would flood land that's currently home to about 2 million people. But if that went up to 4 degrees sea level rise, that would flood land that's currently home to 4 million people. So that's an extra 2 million people who would be affected. So it's always worth doing something, always. What can we as individuals realistically do in our daily lives to prevent climate change? It's a really important question, maybe the most important question. It's easy to feel helpless, but I don't think anyone should. First of all, you shouldn't beat yourself up about it. I mean, here we all are, you know, living our lives in the modern world, and it's important not to feel sort of stressed and guilty. But there are a number of things you can do, and I think one of the best things you can do as an individual is probably not really obvious, but it's wasting as little food as you can. Only buying the food you're really going to eat, and eating the food you actually buy, because sort of the carbon emissions that have been generated through food production and processing and transport are a large component of global emissions, and if we're wasting food, we're having quite a big impact proportionally on the environment there. We've got, this is a good one. Where will polar bears live if the ice melts? Polar bears, it always comes to polar bears. I think, unfortunately, they'll just have to live in the zoo. The ice is a really essential habitat. The Latin name for polar bear is Ursus maritimus, which basically means ocean bear. They spend more of their lives out on the frozen ocean than they do on land, and it's their essential habitat. So if it's not there, probably a few of them will probably be able to stick around and sort of scrap it out on the sort of edge of towns in northern Canada or something like that. But it wouldn't be very good for them, unfortunately. Okay, so next is what is your biggest worry about climate in the next 10 years, or what is the biggest threat to the planet? I think both of these questions have the same answer. What we see at the moment, what we've seen over the past, really even the past few months, has been a lot of momentum behind climate change. We've seen things like the school strikes for climate. We've seen things like Extinction Rebellion. We've seen various branches of the government, obviously in the UK Parliament, vote on a climate emergency. So nothing that happens in the future is inevitable. Everything is within our own hands, and this is I think an almost unique moment. And my biggest worry, therefore, is that we don't seize this moment, that we don't sort of take advantage of this momentum, that we let it slip. So what I'd really like to see is this interest, this momentum, followed up with concrete action as soon as possible. So the next question is, could increased global temperatures be partly down to fluctuations over millennia? It's important to be clear about this, because as we know, there have been large-scale fluctuations of climate in the past. But having said that, the pattern of temperature increase we've seen over the 20th and 21st century so far really doesn't fit any known natural patterns of climate change. It doesn't fit what we know about orbital changes, about changes in solar output, about changes in volcanic activity. None of these can explain the rapid warming over the past 3 or 4 decades in particular, on top of the slower warming in the 20th century. If it was left to its own devices and without any human intervention, as far as we can tell, the planet would probably be cooling very, very slowly. So the pattern of warming we see can't be explained by natural variations, but it does coincide with the enormous increase in greenhouse gases over the same time period. So we have another question. If we continue at our current rate, will both our winters and summers get hotter or colder? So if we take an example of someone who's born today, by the time they get to my age, in about the year 2070, by that stage, if nothing changes on our current pathway, in the East Midlands, where Loughborough is, our winters will be about 2 to 3 degrees centigrade warmer and about 10 to 20% wetter. The summers will be about 3 to 4 degrees centigrade warmer and about 20 to 30% drier. So winters a little warmer and a little wetter, and summers hotter and drier. And for example, very hot summers like the one we had in 2018, we had a very lengthy hot spell and a drought. That would be about every other year we'd be expecting to get a summer like that. Okay, so the next question is, can I, or when will I, be able to wear a tank top in March? To which my answer is, what were you doing in February this year? It was really hot. It was ice cream weather in February. And we also, didn't we, had a record warm Easter bank holiday. So, you know, that was tank top weather as well, although to be fair, it was in April. So I think, you know, we're more or less there on the tank top front. Okay, so I have another one. I live in the UK. Why should I worry about the Arctic? Well, I mean, yeah, why not? In climate terms, the Arctic really is our next door neighbour. For example, here we are in Loughborough. Loughborough is closer to the Arctic Circle than it is to Malaga in southern Spain, where probably a fair proportion of us have been on holiday. Weather in the UK is affected by something you've probably heard of called the jet stream. And the position of the jet stream is really dependent, really sensitively dependent on cold Arctic weather to our north and warm weather to our south. So if the balance between these changes, it has a really big impact on our weather. And so last year we saw a long cold spell in the springtime, and we saw a long hot spell in the summertime, and both of these have implicated in them the behaviour of the Arctic atmosphere. So that's a really important reason to be concerned with what happens in the Arctic. It's our next door neighbour in climate terms. And apart from that, we live on an island, and one of the most important sources of sea level rise is within the Arctic. It's the Greenland ice sheet. It contains many metres of potential sea level rise, so that's another important reason. Okay, so continuing, someone asks, what's the latest with the hole in the ozone layer? Yeah, this is actually a little bit of a rare sort of good news story. The hole in the ozone layer of Antarctica has pretty much stabilised now. It was spotted and it grew larger, but now it's pretty much stabilised. And the reason for that was the ban on the dangerous chemicals that was brought into force as a result of a treaty called the Montreal Protocol, which was signed in 1987. And that in itself is a good news story. But I think what it also shows is that the international community can come together and produce effective, beneficial agreements on the environment. Okay, next question is, what areas are high enough to avoid sea level rise in the future? It's a good question, isn't it? Because sea level rise is one of the most important effects we expect to see over the 21st century, or even further. Sea level rise itself would only affect a very small proportion of the Earth's surface, so there's lots of higher ground to escape to. But the part of the Earth's surface that actually is affected by sea level rise is unfortunately the part huge numbers of people live. Coastlines, for example, are home to almost all of the world's major cities, and you can probably think of some off the top of your head, places like London, New York, Shanghai. These are all sea level cities. They have this vulnerability to sea level rise, and whereas a person can easily get in their car and drive inland, clearly a city is a very different situation. The economic activity, the population, the infrastructure, this is a real issue for some of the world's largest cities in places like Europe and North America, but also especially China, India, Bangladesh and Indonesia through the rest of this century. Okay, so the next question was how long do we really have to reverse our damage, or how drastic would changes have to be to halt global warming? It's bad news and good news. I think the bad news is that certainly within the 21st century, reversing or even halting global warming is difficult. Certainly putting it into reverse. We can certainly stop it getting worse, though. There's widespread agreement that we can stop things getting worse. And the way to achieve that is through achieving what people are calling net zero carbon emissions. And various experts have looked at this, and the government has specifically an advisory body called the Committee on Climate Change that examined this issue for the UK government, and they recently reported that achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050 was realistic and achievable. So the next question is, are our efforts to reduce emissions insignificant compared to US and Chinese pollution behaviours? It's a good question. A lot of people ask this question. It's important, I think, to be aware that the UK so far has been a world leader in bringing emissions targets into law. The 2008 Climate Act placed a legal obligation on British governments, not just the government at the time, but British governments going forward decade by decade. It placed a legal obligation on them to achieve reductions in carbon emissions. And this was landmark legislation. It's world-leading stuff. And so we can be proud of that, because that gave us a lot of credibility on the international diplomatic stage. In addition to that, irrespective of the global warming issue, there are strong health reasons for decarbonising the energy supply. There are strong economic reasons for decarbonising the energy supply, because renewables, solar and wind power now are really, really cheap and extremely competitive, economically speaking. So irrespective of global warming, it would be a smart move. I think it's important to be aware, when we speak of China in particular, that a large part of China's emissions are used in manufacturing goods for other parts of the world, ourselves included, and we should be aware of that. And also that in deploying new power, China is an absolute world leader in developing and deploying renewables. So the economic case for renewables is very strong. Other countries recognise that as well. So the next question here is, what is the most impactful policy Parliament could pass to combat climate change? Well, absolutely. Maybe not many people know this, but surprisingly, I think Parliament already has a lot of what it needs. The Climate Change Act was passed in 2008, and that required governments going forward, decade on decade, to try and achieve cuts in emissions, to have a plan to achieve cuts in carbon emissions. And this was a really forward-looking plan that is still well ahead of what many other countries have actually put into law. So one of the main things we really need to do is not so much pass new legislation as hold our governments to the legislation that exists. And the government also created the Committee on Climate Change to do the research and to review the literature and to produce various reports that would provide the advice for them to do this. I think maybe what we just need to do is make the Climate Change Act just a little bit more ambitious. When it was brought in, it was looking for an 80% decrease in emissions over 1990 levels. We probably need to be more ambitious on that now, but to be honest, we've got the framework in place. Okay, so we have another question, and what actually is climate change? Is a very good question. What is climate change? Well, climate is, if you like, a measure of normal weather. So when we refer to climate change, what we mean is out of the ordinary changes to the pattern of normal weather. But not only that, also its variations and its extremes as well. So climate change is the term that's used to refer to changes in the overall weather, but also in the occurrence of things like droughts, storms, heat waves and floods. Okay, so thanks very much for your questions. Some great questions there, some really important questions. I think it shows that this is an issue that matters to people, that people are thinking about, and we're really grateful that you were able to send your questions to us, and I hope that some of those answers have helped. Thanks again.